Hey everyone, this is Louis7, and today I have a Yellow Line Champion starter build in the Lord of the Rings Online. Of course, the Yellow Line Champion is just great for AoE melee damage. It's great for solo play, it's great for group content, and it is a great choice for leveling if you want to AoE mow mobs down. So here we can see the build that I am using for my character and what I do on this champion. But again, as a starter build, this will be for 50 trait points. And just for reference, that is what you will have at level 70 now. But let's go ahead and respec and start getting into the build. So of course, the big theme of the Yellow Line Champion is AoE damage. That one's pretty obvious, but there are actually a few important debuffs that make them extra valuable in group content besides just their AoE damage that we should pay attention to as a theme. So when we spec in, we first of all get Bladestorm. So it's an odd ability because especially at higher levels, you just don't end up needing to use it that frequently because you have so many other options. Even some of your fervor building abilities can do more than Bladestorm, which consumes fervor. So it is a little bit odd, but I did just want to point that out on my leveling champion. I find myself actually rarely ever needing to use Bladestorm. It's mainly a filler when everything else is on cooldown typically. The other ability we get is going to build fervor, and this one has a very nice bleed with it and an armor debuff, decreasing the enemy's mitigation, so you and your group can do more damage to them. So Rend is going to be very valuable for that. Additionally, you will have your AoE abilities, which are going to be the blade skills. That's what all the AoEs are categorized. They're categorized as blade abilities. You can see that in the tooltip in the fourth line of gray text where it says skill type harmful, blade. Those have a chance to give you decreased attack duration, so you attack faster. But let's go ahead and spec in and we can start with a build. And I should point out very early in this is that there are a lot of options and a lot of flexibility. So I'm going to go over each of the traits as I normally would, and I will be building towards my 50 trait point starter build. But I just really want to emphasize here, you can select which traits you want for what content you run and what fits best for your character and what you actually do in the game on your Yellow Line Champion. So to start off here, we do have a few different options. One of them is going to be a minute cooldown skill that can increase our fervor a little bit initially and over time as well. At this point, a lot of our damage is actually going to be in our fervor builder, so we don't really need fervor too much, just to point out. Our strongest ability is, besides Rend and the value it provides, is actually going to be Blade Wall. Blade Wall is a really strong attack, and it's actually one of our higher damage abilities as a Yellow Line Champion, so that's just something to keep in mind. There's also a trait that increases might, and what's interesting about this trait is putting 1 point in it gives you the most value, because for 1 point with my numbers is 2,430 might, and actually getting 5 ranks in it would double that, so you get half of the total value just from 1 point, 1/5 of the total ranks. So that could be worth putting 1 point into for consideration. And the last trait here just increases our blade skill damage up to 10% with 5 ranks. That's going to overall be beneficial towards us. That said, I recommend going ahead and putting 1 point into might, because again, getting that first rank is very valuable in increasing your damage. I should also point out that increasing main stats is not the most efficient. What you're really worried about is going to be how your secondary stats, the offensive ones here, change: crit rating, finesse, and physical mastery. So putting 1 point in that will actually give us quite a big physical mastery boost. The numbers might be different for your character, but if I go from 174.6%, put 1 point into that and apply it, I go all the way up to 177.6%, so that's a 3% increase. And because it's physical mastery, that affects everything we do and not just our blade abilities. So after 1 point in that is when I like to go ahead and get Battle Frenzy, so I can go ahead and have that and have fervor generation. While I said I don't tend to use Bladestorm itself too frequently, Horn of Gondor can be very great for survivability and just getting a big AoE stun, but also it does have a nice mitigation debuff. It's actually useful in group content for that as well, even outside the stun and in longer fights that you may find yourself in. You also have Clobber, which is a great ability to animation cancel with it being immediate, and it also has the actual use of interrupting inductions. That one consumes fervor. You also have bracing attack, so you have a few different things here that consume fervor that you might find value out of. And speaking of some utility and other abilities that consume fervor, I will say if you're playing a yellow line champion but find yourself in single target situations a lot, it might be worth going ahead and spending 2 trait points in brutal strikes, but I'm going to avoid that because I play the yellow line champion for AoE. And at this point, I go ahead and put 3 points into blade skill damage as a sort of filler trait. And with this, we will unlock the next row and have more traits to look at. But that's how I would tend to spend my first 5 points. So in the next row, I already mentioned that Blade Wall is actually going to be a very strong ability, and I know when you get your maxed LI and all sorts of things like that, it's going to be one of the highest sources of damage as a yellow line champion, so it's good to keep in mind that boosting that damage by 50% is actually pretty significant. So if you find yourself using Blade Wall a lot, know that this trait is of course good. Next up, though, we can increase the number of targets for our AoE abilities, and that is also very valuable. If you're attacking more than 5 targets, which is our pretty much limit now with our AoE abilities, this will make you hit even more of them, so it can be very valuable with that. But what makes this really special is going to be the 5th rank. That will make Swift Strike, which is a strike ability, so it's a single target ability. This will turn it into a blade ability, so it gets all the benefits of your blade attacks, and it just becomes AoE itself. So that's going to be a nice, very quick attack here. Can just give you a little bit of quick AoE filler damage and build your fervor. Otherwise, we have Raging Blade. That's probably the most exciting thing here because it's a new active skill that consumes fervor that compared to Blade Storm is actually good. So this is going to be very exciting to get, and we will definitely put 1 point in that. Now, where I will go from here is to put points in Broad Sweep, and we'll put 4 points in it for now because that's what unlocks the next row, and we have to take a look at these traits. First one improves Battle Frenzy. It will make it ultimately add more fervor at the beginning. Like when you first use it, it adds 2 fervor now. At 3 ranks, this would end up adding 5 fervor and maxing your fervor out. But rank 4 in this one is pretty special because it first of all reduces the cooldown of Battle Frenzy in half. It will now be 30 seconds, and it will only last 10 seconds though. But during these 10 seconds, you get 1 fervor every second, so you rapidly refill your fervor during Battle Frenzy. Now, it will change the dynamics of the ability a little bit, but getting 4 ranks in that would be helpful to help us maintain high fervor, which will become more important as we start getting better fervor-consuming abilities, such as we did get with Raging Blade. Otherwise, we can increase our Horn of Gondor damage. While Horn of Gondor is overall going to be a useful ability for its stun and mitigation debuff, it's not necessarily the most important for its raw upfront damage, so we will probably avoid that for now. And that is a trait I tend to just not pick up at all as a yellow line champion. Next trait in this row is going to be increasing Raging Blade damage, so that's going to be very valuable. It's one of our stronger abilities at this point as well, and compared to just boosting Blade Wall damage, this is slightly more efficient just because you get 20% increased damage per trait point instead of 10% increased damage. But having said that, you can actually use Blade Wall more frequently. It's a 4.2 second cooldown ability, while Blade Wall here, Raging Blade rather, is going to be an 10 second cooldown ability and has the fervor cost up front. While you want to pretty much use it on cooldown, especially at this point, you cannot use it quite as much. So that's another consideration here. Again, a lot of considerations in your trait point choices. So at this point, I would actually go ahead and fill out Broad Sweep. And with that, I will have 5 AoE targets, but the main thing is getting Swift Strike to become Swift Blade. So if we apply that, we can actually see Swift Blade here becomes an AoE with max 8 targets and just quick AoE attack you can use. So I will try to not repeat this all too much in this episode, but it's a great time to reiterate. At this point, you can pretty much choose traits as you see fit for what abilities you actually use in combat the most. For me, I probably would not get too much utilization out of Battle Frenzy, so I will set that off to the side for now. I would use Blade Wall a lot. Blade Wall is really strong. That's one of the highest value abilities, so that is appealing, and similar with Raging Blade. That said, I do like the general aspect of just improving our damage overall with blade skill damage, so I'll put 2 points in that for now. I will comment on Might once again just because that gives us only a little bit of a boost. We saw a pretty large boost with the first rank, but not seeing too much benefit with the further points, so I would rather either get raw blade wall damage or raging blade damage from here. In my experience, I would tend to get better value out of raging blade damage, so I will go ahead and put 2 points in that. Again, flexibility there. Now, the next row has some more interesting choices. So finesse, this is going to be a little bit of an inefficient trait in that it takes a lot of ranks to really build up your finesse to a useful value. But if you have enough finesse and do not get block parry evaded, you don't get avoided basically, and you don't get resisted on your abilities, then there is no need to get finesse. But if you find yourself needing finesse, you can always spend your trait points on that because hitting an enemy is very valuable. Of course, you don't just like want to be missing. So while I know finesse is not an exciting trait, you might find good value out of it, but I have not found that to be the case on my leveling champion who was around this point. So instead, let's go ahead and look at the other traits before I forget. So here we have Great Cleave and the one that is linked to that, which is Battle Acuity. So Great Cleave right now costs 5 fervor. Well, it requires 5 fervor, it doesn't actually consume it, and it will make your AoE attacks cost 1 less fervor. Again, I tend to not really have any fervor issues because my fervor generators are actually really strong abilities, and it's mainly for Raging Blade, occasionally using another utility ability, and Horn of Gondor. So I wouldn't find too much value in a cooldown just for that. Where it becomes interesting though is this trait will have it boost your AoE damage up to 25% AoE damage, and that's going to be a 30-second uptime with a 2-minute cooldown. So basically, you could kind of think of it like you have a 25% uptime of the effect here. So at rank 5, you would have like 25% of 25% AoE damage boost, which would work out to 6.25%. That's just one way you can think about it to like try to think about the value you would get out of spending trait points on it. It's not quite perfect because you'll probably get a little bit more utilization out of the 30-second buff, especially if you save this for particular fights where you really need that boost, and then other fights it doesn't really matter too much. I know it's not that simple, but again, it's a way to think about some value you get out of those trait points. So in my experience playing champions in general and recently leveling one of them, I would once again find myself tending to get the most value out of Raging Blade damage at this point, and then boosting Blade Wall damage. So putting 4 points in the Barbed Wall and increasing our Blade Wall damage will unlock the next row. At this point, this row only has 1 trait choice, and that's going to be a sort of decent one for healing and survivability. I know sometimes yellow line champions can feel squishy just because you want to pull like hundreds of enemies, and they can tend to do somewhat decent damage against you, so it could be appealing for that. But one other thing I do want to point out, while we'll get to all the set bonuses later, I did want to point out we did get a fervor consuming one. It's not really that big of a deal, but there is going to be an extra thing that consumes fervor with Exchange of Blows. That tends to only be useful in solo content and when you're taking a lot of damage, and pretty much just putting up before a fight starts, but I did want to point that out since we've been talking about fervor generation a lot. So anyway, at this point, I would probably go ahead and put 1 point in Blade of Courage. If you want even more survivability, you can feel free to put more points into it. But I like having 1 point in that because it gives me a 10% chance on any Blade ability that I use to restore 5% max morale. At rank 3, that would go up to 1 in every 5 Blade abilities you use on average would restore 5% morale. So that helps with some self-healing and actually surviving in these AoE situations. But I am fine with just 1 point in that. So moving on from there, I would go ahead and get 1 more point in Blade Wall damage, and now I have to consider something else to move down the yellow line, which would be Ardent Rage. Putting 3 points in that unlocks the next row, which is another single trait row. And this one is Champion's Advantage. So with this, every blade skill you use, you have a 20% chance to give yourself a 12-second buff where you bypass enemy mitigations, so you ignore some of their armor and ultimately do more damage. Now this trait comes into play more the more mitigations your enemy has, which tends to be true for tougher enemies. Like the weak enemies that you tend to fight on the landscape, this is probably not going to have like the hugest impact just bypassing some of their mitigation, which isn't much to begin with. But if you're running group content or doing anything with tougher enemies that have lots of mitigation, it's definitely a good trait to consider. And overall, as you probably saw in the build preview, it is going to be worth getting eventually. But at this point, I find more value in getting the last point in Ardent Rage to get better fervor generation. And speaking of fervor generation, I once again have to highlight a set bonus here, and the main point to highlight for ardor increase is that champion damage is increased per fervor pip. So maintaining high fervor can definitely be valuable because you just do more damage while you have high fervor now. So I think with that in mind, and with this row, it's a good time to get a little refresher of other trait options we have. If you need finesse, now is a great time to put points in finesse. You also have might for an overall relatively minor damage boost, but would give you an all-around damage boost. Horn of Gondor damage, again, not really worth considering. Then survivability boost would be Blade of Courage. And the other option is going to be Great Cleave, and putting a point in that, as well as putting points into Battle Acuity. That's mainly what we'd be interested in, Battle Acuity, for the short duration damage buff. At this point, for the most value out of my trait points, it would be in Champion's Advantage, and this will leave me needing to spend one more trait point to unlock the next row, and the next row is going to have some very valuable stuff for us. So this is where we run into a little bit of a conundrum, because we have to consider what the ultimate build will look like for this 50 trait point starter build. And if we put just, let's say we go ahead and put 1 point in Great Cleave, because that seems like it'd be the most appealing thing. If we ignore the other 2 specs, that is probably where we would go next. But the problem is Great Cleave itself is not going to be very useful. And if I just spent 1 point in something, let's have it be Great Cleave, we would end up getting both of these traits here at the bottom, but then we would actually like to go into the red line for a particularly appealing trait here with decreased attack duration to give you an overall boost to your damage and attacking faster, as well as the melee crit chance at the top left here. And why this is important is because spending trait points in the red line will cost us 2 trait points, so it's a little bit more costly to go into the red line, but a lot of this stuff is more valuable than what we have in the yellow line, including Great Cleave and buffing that with Battle Acuity. So while ultimately I actually did not have any points in finesse increase because this character is all set on finesse and I don't need that, and I eventually had points in Battle Acuity on this character for a higher trait point build than the starter build, I would end up going towards Great Cleave and Battle Acuity, but maybe not everybody has finesse settled, and maybe they could get good value out of finesse, or if you want more survivability again, you could get Blade of Courage, and if you don't want any of those options, you could just go ahead and put 1 point in Might. I, for the purposes of this, will go ahead and put 1 point in finesse because that can definitely be helpful while leveling, just to have a little bit of a boost to ensure we're not getting BPE'd. So I know that was a long sidetrack, but ultimately that does get us to the bottom 2 traits, and the most appealing one to get first is going to be Fury of Blades, because that is going to be our big fervor consumer, the one that removes 5 fervor and does more damage based on how much fervor you have. You want to use that at maximum fervor and it will just do a whole lot of AoE damage for you. So we'll put 1 point in that, and then the next trait is also going to be very helpful, and that blade skills have a chance, 15% chance, to generate 1 fervor for every target hit. So if you hit a lot of targets, odds are you will be generating some decent fervor from this, and it will be overall helpful in keeping our fervor up so we can keep spending it with abilities like Fury of Blades now, as well as Raging Blade and other things. So we will put 1 point in that, and now is the time that I would actually start digging into the red line for the starter build. So to start off, I already mentioned that you could put 2 points into Brutal Strikes. That is 2 trait points for 1 rank in Brutal Strikes, because that is a great single target ability if you felt like you needed single target help. So I think now is going to be a great time to go ahead and get that and help our single target out a little bit. The other traits that are going to be most impactful, while at high levels you could end up finding some use with the Wild Swings to get Wild Attack, when you get a critical hit with Wild Attack, that will give you a 5% crit chance buff, which is of course very valuable. That's something that tends to be run with endgame champions, even yellow line ones. We would rather just go ahead and get flat critical chance before we start worrying about that. Now, for the purposes of the starter build, again, we won't have to worry about our strike skills, but that's something that's going to be helpful for single target fights and tends to be picked after you finish the yellow line stuff out for a yellow line champion. But I just want to point that out again. For the starter build, we will go ahead and ignore that. So really our option is going to be either decreased attack duration or increased crit chance 1 more point. And unfortunately, as fun as decreasing our attack duration is, it's going to be better to go ahead and get 1 more % crit chance, and then spending the rest of our that'd be 6 trait points into decreased attack duration. And that is where this 50 trait point starter build for the Yellow Line Champion is going to end. There are a few different things that you can look out for in the future. I run what might be a little bit of a weird build with Sweeping Riposte. This is pretty much only useful when you are soloing content, but the main benefit of Sweeping Riposte is not necessarily in the damage that it does, but that it is an immediate ability, so you can use it to animation cancel, especially some of the longer animation abilities you have, like Raging Blade and Furia Blades. It's even valuable to animation cancel things like Rend, and pretty much again anything with an animation. You just use one ability and then queue up Sweeping Riposte right after that, and you will effectively get 2 abilities in one. Again, that tends to be a little bit of an odd build, but it is fun. Other things you can look out for that is perhaps more standard is going to be Controlled Burn. That is going to be very valuable cooldown that you can get for your Yellow Line Champion to just boost your damage. I also should point out again, you would probably want to consider going into Battle Acuity and finishing out the Might trait here. And now that we have the Clash trait build done, let's go ahead and look at the set bonuses. So the first one here, Ardor, is just going to reduce the power cost of our abilities per fervor pip, so up to 25% power cost reduction. I tend to not run into power issues, at least if I have a single piece of Fate gear or in combat power raging gear, but sometimes you can run into issues at lower levels, so this would just help a little bit with that. Next trait is going to affect Rend, and it basically increases the amount of stacks that Rend can go up to with its bleed, so now it can stack up to 5 times, so you can start to get a pretty decent dot out of that. Third set bonus here is going to increase our critical rating while Flurry is active. So if you don't remember what Flurry is, that is going to be the buff that your blade skills can give you to decrease your attack duration. That critical rating buff from it does not scale well with levels, so that's actually a really horrible buff for the level 120 character that I am, and that's basically negligible critical rating. But the more important thing is that it gives increased duration to Flurry by 10 seconds, so that is helpful. Next set bonus is going to be Exchange of Blows, which I already talked about a little bit, but that is going to be a moderate cooldown fervor consumer, cost 2 fervor to reflect 50% of damage when you are hit. That can be valuable in big AoE situations, just to basically let enemies kill themselves. Next set bonus though is going to be Ardor Increase, which we already talked about, increasing champion skill damage by 5% for fervor pip, so up to 25% at 5 fervor. But the other thing it gives you is increased tactical mitigation per fervor pip. And it says that rating is based on champion level. So the question is that buff helpful? And I have, for my particular character and stats here, I'm at level 120. It is fairly decent, and maybe just something to keep in mind that you do get a little bit of tactical mitigation from having fervor. Next up is going to be Furious Swings, which gives every blade skill a chance to give you 1 fervor pip, and then the other effect it has, I know sometimes tooltips can be annoying in the way they're structured in LOTRO, but just a completely separate effect is going to be what we care about maybe even more, which is just raw blade skill damage increased by 30%, pretty significant boost at that level. And the final set bonus is actually going to be the least useful one. Born for Combat. It seems like it should be an exciting thing, 10 target AoE, but one, it has a kind of odd requirement. You have to get hit by enemies 10 times, then you can use it, but it just doesn't do good damage. Compared to all your other abilities, this is not worth using, so it's basically a pointless set bonus right now. Anyway, now that the set bonuses are covered, we can briefly look at virtue traits. As usual, I recommend checking out my stat guide and virtue guide for more information than what is covered here, but briefly I run the standard DPS package, which includes loyalty as the top virtue for overall defensive boost, oddly enough, and then our actually offensive virtues are going to be Valor and Wit, tend to be the 2 highest value ones to start off with, and then Confidence and Zeal are pretty good as well. As a bonus tip, actually, if you do have Wit, that might take some weight off of the Finesse Increase Clash trait, which would be more valuable and efficient to go ahead and get the Wit Virtue trait than have to spend your Clash trait points, which could be spent on much more valuable things. So if you do need Finesse, Wit can really help with that. And otherwise, you can always substitute these in for defensive options like Fidelity, Tolerance, and Charity. And that will be it for the starter build guide for the Yellow Line Champion. I hope you all enjoyed it and learned something useful about this spec, and if you did, please consider liking and subscribing for more, or becoming a channel member to support the content and get access to guides like this early. And thanks for watching, everyone.